COVID-19 in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Good News, Part 1. For the purposes of this analysis, I will define Sub-Saharan Africa as the set of countries south of Northern Africa. That's this entire grayed area here. There are a variety of definitions of Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm taking a relatively broad definition that includes Mauritania and the Sudan. Obviously, Sub-Saharan Africa is the bulk of the land area of Africa. It has a population of about 1.13 billion people, which represents 85% of the population of Africa as a whole, and about 1/7 of the world population. In this analysis, I will look at the differences between Sub-Saharan Africa versus Western Europe and the US. The first difference has to do with demographics. The second difference has to do with pre-existing health conditions, and the third difference has to do with heat. I will show that the implication is that the effect of COVID-19 on Sub-Saharan Africa should be minor. I will test this implication with empirical data, draw some conclusions, and then ask the important question, is the cure worse than the disease? Difference 1, demographics. African countries, particularly those in Sub-Saharan Africa, have very different age demographics than Western Europe and the US. How might that difference affect the impact of COVID-19? The reason we care about age demographics is that most of the deaths are in the elderly. It turns out that about 44% of all the deaths from COVID-19 are in people 65 to 79 years old, and 46% of the deaths are from people 80 years old and older. If we combine these two categories, we get a whopping 90% of the deaths from COVID-19 in people who are 65 years old and older. This means a population with more old people is going to be hit harder by COVID-19. Here's the population age distribution for Italy. On the left-hand side, the first bar corresponds to 0 to 4 years old, and this shows that just under 4% of the population are in that age cohort. If we look at the peak of this distribution, we see that about a little bit over 8% of the population is in the age cohort of people from 50 to 54 years old. Looking to the right-hand side, we see that from 80 years old and up, there's a substantial chunk of people. And from 65 and up, there's also a substantial chunk of people. Now let's look at the age distribution in the African country of Niger. This is very different than the age distribution in Italy. For example, almost 20% of the population is in the 0 to 4-year-old age group, and this declines, the height of the cohort bars decline very rapidly with age. This is not because there are a lot of people dying in transitioning from one cohort to the next. It's mostly because of the fact that this is a rapidly growing population. The population in Niger is growing at about 4% a year. And one of the implications of this is that only a small percentage of the population is in the age category of 80 years old and up. If only a small percentage of the people are in this most vulnerable age, then you're going to have only a very small percentage of deaths from COVID-19. Now let's put the population age distributions for Italy and Niger on the same graph so that we can compare them. We can see immediately that there's a much larger percentage of the Italian population in the older age categories. Here I have grayed out the age groupings in Italy for 65 and up. You can see that this triangle for Italy is much larger than the corresponding triangle for Niger. So let's group some of these key age cohorts together and see what we can conclude. In Italy, we see that about 13% of the population falls in the 0 to 14 age group, whereas in Niger, about 50% of the population falls in that age group. That's important because the people in this age group are the least susceptible to COVID-19. If we look at the other end of the spectrum, a full 7.5% of the Italian population is 80 years old and older, and a mere 0.23% of the population in Niger is 80 and older. Looking further at the 65 and up category, we have 23% for Italy and only 2.6% in Niger. It turns out that Italy has one of the oldest populations in the world and Niger has one of the youngest, so maybe this isn't a totally fair comparison. Instead, let's compare Western Europe versus all of Sub-Saharan Africa. We see that the age category from 0 to 4 counts for almost 16% of the population in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's less than the almost 20% of the population in Niger, but still we see this fundamentally steep decline in the age distribution. The growth rate in Sub-Saharan Africa is about 2.6% a year. The growth rate in Western Europe is just barely above 0%. We see the same fundamental larger percentage of older people in Western Europe, particularly in the 80 and up, and the 65 and up category. Far higher percentage of the people are in those age groupings than for Sub-Saharan Africa. Now let's summarize key age cohorts for Western Europe versus Sub-Saharan Africa. We see that in the 0 to 14 year age grouping, that 16% of Western Europeans fall into that versus 42% for Sub-Saharan Africa. The disparity between the two is less than it is for Italy versus Niger, but there's still a substantial number of people in the age cohort that's least affected by COVID-19. At the other end of the spectrum, we see that 6.3% of Western Europeans are 80 and up versus 0.34% in Sub-Saharan Africa, and for 65 and up we get 21% and 3%. I wanted to point out that you don't have to be a medical professional to understand this, nor do you have to be a professional at building models. The data I've presented here is very transparent straight from the UN, and the reasoning process is very simple and transparent. Because there's a smaller percentage of the people in the most vulnerable age group for Sub-Saharan Africa, we can expect a smaller percentage of deaths from COVID-19. Difference number 2, pre-existing conditions. The Sub-Saharan African countries have very different health profiles than Western Europe and the US. How might that difference affect the impact of COVID-19? If you look at the risk factors behind hospitalizations with COVID-19 in Italy, the US, Sweden, and Spain, we have factors such as hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, chronic lung disease, immune system problems, and kidney disease. Well, it turns out that the top 3 of these are closely linked to obesity, and kidney disease is fairly closely linked to diabetes, which is linked to obesity. So a number of the risk factors associated with hospitalization from COVID-19 are basically diseases of affluence. I highly recommend doing an internet search on obesity rates by continent and taking a look at a map of that. There are several available. I won't reproduce it here for copyright reasons, but it's striking how much less obesity there is, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, than any place else in the world. Northern Africa has substantially more obesity than Sub-Saharan Africa. Because there's much less obesity in Sub-Saharan Africa than in the US and Western Europe, we can expect far fewer hospitalizations as a percent of the population in Africa. Difference number 3, heat. Sub-Saharan African countries have very different climates than Western Europe and the US. How might that difference affect the impact of COVID-19? Viruses tend to be destroyed by heat, sunlight, and humidity. This is why the flu tends to disappear in the summertime. There's some uncertainty about how strongly COVID-19 will be affected by these, but if it is affected, Africa is in a really good position because it's got a lot of sunlight and many parts of it are very hot. I highly recommend doing a search on solar intensity by continent. If you look at a map of that, it's striking how much more solar radiation Africa gets than many other places around the world. This suggests that if COVID-19 behaves similarly to other viruses, it might have trouble spreading in hot countries in Africa, particularly in rural areas where there's no air conditioning. So we see that Sub-Saharan Africa is not like Western Europe. The population age structure is much younger. Because there's a much smaller percentage of old people, we can expect a correspondingly smaller percentage of deaths from COVID-19. There is also much less obesity, which means fewer of the risk factors associated with death by COVID-19, and also the climate is much warmer, which suggests that the virus may have a more difficult time spreading. So the preliminary conclusion is that COVID-19 should have far less impact on Sub-Saharan Africa than on Western Europe. So let's test this preliminary conclusion against the data. In order to do that, I chose a sample of 12 different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. Why 12 countries? Well, the reason is it's simply a lot of work to type in the data for all the countries. The particular set of countries I chose was chosen somewhat randomly around Africa. Their total population adds up to about 333 million people. This is slightly less than 1/3 of the population of Sub-Saharan Africa and is about equivalent to the population of the United States. Here's a map of Africa. The 12 countries selected for this study appear in color. You can see that an effort was made to choose countries in a variety of locations around Africa. The only significance of the different colors is an attempt so that we could see the country boundaries. As a reference point, let's look at the progression of this disease in Italy. We see that the new cases per day grew more or less exponentially, peaked at about 6,500 cases per day on March 21st, and then went through a slow, kind of noisy decline since then. We see that new deaths per day grew as well, peaked on March 27th, 6 days after the peak in new cases, and are going through a gradual decline as well. Now let's look at new cases and deaths per day for this group of 12 African nations. New cases didn't begin until about mid-March, and lately they've been averaging about 150 per day, although the data is very noisy. The deaths per day has been very low. The maximum has been about 6. Now, of course, this graph tops out at 300 per day. The graph for Italy topped out at 7,000 per day. In order to really put this data into perspective, we need to put Italy and these 12 African countries on the same graph. This graphic shows new cases per day for Italy and the group of Africa 12 nations. And we saw, as before, the rapid rise to over 6,500 cases per day for Italy, followed by the slow decline. And for the Africa 12 countries, the new cases per day are so low that they barely register above the horizontal axis. Actually, this is not entirely a fair comparison because the Africa 12 countries have about 330 million people and Italy has only about 60 million people. If we were to normalize the Africa 12 data for population, then we would have to lower this curve by a factor of 5. That's all I have time for in this YouTube video. For the exciting conclusion to this analysis, please watch part 2.